Good afternoon from ZTN Studios in Harare, Zimbabwe. Welcome to the National Pulse. Our discussion today, the social and economic implications of COVID-19. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim's TV network, ZTN, and our partners, the Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development, Zimcodd. Hello, I'm Andy Hodges. The COVID-19 crisis is affecting the entire world economy and that of Africa. Some key sectors of the African economy are already experiencing a slowdown as a result of the pandemic. Tourism, air transport and the oil sector are visibly impacted. However, invisible impacts of COVID-19 are expected in 2020 regardless of the duration of the pandemic. The external effects come from direct trade links being affected, partner continents such as Asia, Europe and the United States, tourism, the decline in remittances from African diaspora, foreign direct investment and official development assistance, illicit financing flows and domestic financial market tightening. These are some examples. The internal effects occur as a result of the rapid spread of the virus in many African countries. On one hand, they are linked to morbidity and mortality. On the other hand, they lead to a disruption of economic activities. This may cause a decrease in domestic demand in tax revenue and commodity prices, coupled with an increase in public expenditure to safeguard human health and support economic activities. Joining us on the National Pulse today to discuss the social and economic implications of COVID-19, we are joined in the studio by John Maketo from Zimcodd Programs Manager. And joining us on the line during the show, we will be speaking to Peter Mutasa from the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions President, Honourable Priscilla Mishiarambwi Mushonga, Chairperson, Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Primary and Secondary Education, and Richard Mawarire as an economist. Anyway, John, welcome to the National Pulse. Now, John,
thank you, Andy.
I understand that some of the social and economic impacts of the coronavirus are already being felt, and that the world will further suffer the long-term post-COVID-19 impacts. Can you outline the social and economic implications of COVID-19 on the poor and vulnerable groups?
Sure. Thank you very much, Andy. We are in a very sad situation, and the records show that since 1918, when we had the Spanish flu, the pandemic that we're experiencing currently has never been experienced before. And this has actually, exceeded the impact in terms of the social and economic impacts of the crisis. We've had other pandemics and other crises before, but this one is unprecedented. But quickly to come back to your question in terms of the social and economic impacts on the vulnerable, I think just to point out that in order to control the pandemic, to flatten the pandemic curve, there were a number of measures that were taken by jurisdictions in various countries and also even recommended by the World Health Organization, such as the current lockdown that other countries have undertaken, Zimbabwe included. Of course, other countries have not taken such measures. But coming to Zimbabwe, during the lockdown, we have seen that there has been a lot of inactivity within the informal sector. And whereas we understand that more than 86% of Zimbabwe are employed in the informal sector, and that's a huge effect on the economy at large in terms of household economies and also in terms of the fiscal revenue. Then also in terms of inactivity within the small to medium enterprises, and also some people that were living also from hand to mouth, our vendors and so forth. There's been a huge impact in terms of access to basic necessities. Families are struggling to pay their monthly rentals. Yes, government urged that rentals can be suspended, but you see at the household levels, many in Zimbabwe have invested their pensions and incomes in houses and buildings, and so therefore they're also looking to rentals as incomes, and to tell someone that you cannot charge your rent because of the crisis.
It's a catch-22, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, if I don't pay you, you don't have the money then to continue doing what you're doing.
Exactly. So that's the challenge that you then get to face, and they are demanding these rentals. And we are faced, we are also talking about a number of household members being at home, school children are at home and everything, and the consumption apparently it's been reported that it's gone high,
of course,
because people are at home and mostly redundant.
But John, one area which I think people they're aware of, but it's not being talked about too loudly, of course, is that while this is happening, prices of basic commodities or prices in shops have gone up from the pre-lockdown by almost 500 to 600%. And even today, prices have gone up again. I mean, that must really impact on the poor and vulnerable in particular.
Definitely, and the government has actually acknowledged that. Hence, we had, as of last week, when the Vice President actually announced that there is need for the government to take a move to, to freeze prices. But then that has its own, repercussions. When you freeze prices, business tends to withdraw and supply side suffers. But
I mean, we've seen that in the past, haven't
we?
When prices were frozen, products disappeared.
But in terms of what you're talking about, in how poor and vulnerable begins to suffer because they cannot afford the price of basic commodities. In fact, some basic commodities are off the shelf now. Your cooking oil, sugar, the meal. You can find it on the shelves because it has disappeared after the price freeze, and people are now buying not out of necessity, but in order to, out of speculation, to ensure that they've got sufficient supplies in days to come. And
I think here we're talking obviously about supply chain breakdowns, and I think that's one area that we'll discuss maybe a little bit later on. But if you look at the economics perspective in terms of the sectors, I mean, I mentioned earlier that the tourism has been hardest hit, and I think the World Trade Tourism Authority is saying that almost 250 million tourism workers will lose their jobs. But there are other sectors, because every sector is affected, is it not? What are the main sectors you think that are hardest hit by this? In
Zimbabwe, besides the tourism sector, definitely, like you highlighted, it's one of the hardest hit. Hotel occupants have definitely decreased, and the number of workers have been laid off, especially the contract workers, your chefs and waitresses and so forth, because of the low revenues that's coming in. Then also the manufacturing sector, it's already been under a lot of strain, and they cannot manage to continue to pay workers when there is no production, and also because of the restrictions in movements. Most of manufacturing depends on getting raw materials from one point to another, and that has also suffered a lot. And
as you said, sorry, John.
Yeah.
The economy is connected. It's interconnected, isn't it?
It's very connected.
It's like banks are connected because people are not transacting, so banks are losing revenue from that way. And please continue. Definitely.
So the manufacturing sector, then also the mining sector. The mining sector, and this also remembers we are not existing in isolation. There's also the global market that determines, the market price and so forth. And definitely commodities like platinum, they face the knock, and this affects production at the local industry. And in agriculture as well. Agriculture, remember, tobacco contributes a lot of foreign currency to Zimbabwe, earning us close to 520 million per year. And this industry has suffered as a result of restricted movements. The market of tobacco has been delayed, and there's a lot of uncertainties. And also thinking, if most of our buyers are coming from outside the country, what is their travel arrangement when the country is under lockdown and the borders are closed? Do we really have the number of buyers that we usually have? And we are saying the agriculture industry supports a minimum of 1.2 million people in Zimbabwe. Households that depends on tobacco industry. And when this has been affected, it means that a lot of households are going to be suffering.
And of course, the tobacco auction floors are supposed to be opening in today, in fact. And that's a total bit of confusion about how the crop is getting in. And also, as you said, commodities mining, because of lack of demand. Because of the lockdown worldwide, there's less demand for commodities. And I know, for example, some of the mining houses are hanging on to the product because they aren't able to deliver it. Now, we're joined on the line by Richard Mawarire. He's an economist. Richard, welcome to the National Pulse.
Good afternoon, Andy. Thanks for having me on the program.
Richard, now, what have been the observed impacts of COVID-19 pandemic on the global economy so far? In your opinion, what is the expected effect of this pandemic on the Zimbabwean economic landscape? And are you able to quantify in dollars and cents, so to speak, how much COVID-19 will actually cost Zimbabwe?
Okay, that's a good question, Andy. I think it's a global scale. We all have seen how the COVID-19 has affected the recent slump in the oil industry. how crude oil over the past week has been trading, even going below zero in some of the instances. We all have seen platinum from ever since the COVID was declared a global pandemic. Platinum has lost about 20% in terms of the price per fine ounce. Gold, to some extent, I think it has performed one or two miracles. It has sort of like sustained despite the pressures on other minerals and commodities. So obviously, coming to Zimbabwe now, this obviously naturally affects us as an economy. Remember, our mining sector contributes about 2.2 billion annually in terms of your net foreign currency earnings for the economy. In fact, it is the biggest contributor at 32%. So with all these uncertainties, it poses a bit of challenges to us as an economy. Obviously, we have been having a protracted battle with foreign currency supply in this economy ever since the year 2016. So this sort of like aggravates our already very difficult problems. And also, let me highlight that the other area that we will be affected in a big way as an economy is your remittances and the tourism sector as well. So,
I mean, do you have an idea, Richard, how much? Because I've always tried to get this number. How much do you think? And I know numbers are being worked out now, but how much is Zimbabwe really losing in money? I mean, I hear numbers of 400 million, 600 million in the past month alone. Is that reasonable?
I think a reasonable indicator would be for us to let's go by two numbers. CZI is focusing that capacity utilization has declined from 60 to 20%. So if we are to go by Q4 revenue numbers from Zimra, we collected a total of about 12 billion in the fourth quarter of 2019. So if that figure, 60% to 20%, is anything to go by, then we should anticipate that ever since the lockdown was put into place, which is between the period March and July, we should be able to lose anything close to $1 billion in terms of tax revenue alone. But remember, this is a follow-through effect on other sectors, because remember, the government is number one. It is the biggest player in the economy. It is the biggest employer as well. So probably we are still yet to realize the full negative effect of this COVID-19 pandemic. And that was obviously also adds on to the other areas that I highlighted around the foreign currency issues.
Right. Now, Richard, one area that you mentioned in passing is oil, because the oil price, as you know, has crashed. In fact, at some point it was at zero and even negative for future oil contracts. However, so I mean, I can call that good news, tongue-in-cheek, so to speak, because of course it's terrible that we're in a pandemic. But that oil price is not being translated to lower fuel prices here, of course, because of our own pricing of the commodity on the street, correct?
Yeah, number one is to do with our own pricing framework in Zimbabwe, and number two, it's our clear lack of capacity to utilize chances in which the global oil prices would have declined. My recommendation would have been that if we had enough storage capacity, probably we could have taken advantage of the slump in the crude oil price and hold as much oil as we can and store it. Probably if we can have a 2-3 month cover in our stocks.
In fact, you're right, Richard.
Economy quite a lot.
We should be looking at forward purchasing. But anyway, let me move on now. Do you think a local bailout package is a suitable policy alternative for Zimbabwe? What are the pros and cons of such a policy alternative?
I think Zimbabwe is a bit of a unique case. Remember, we don't have as many options in as far as our choices are concerned. Remember, in the absence of an IMF or World Bank bailout package, and on the other end, tax revenues are also decreasing. There really isn't that much in terms of an option for Zimbabwe. So it leaves us with one option, rely on the fiscal. But remember, it also comes with its problems as well, because we've been battling with foreign currency exchange volatility. We've been having inflation, I think, for the past 2 years. So, in as much as it is an option, but it also aggravates the problems that we've already been having in our economy. So it's not much of an option, but we just have to do it. But
it's the only option available to us.
Yes, but we have to have the full knowledge that it will come with. It will sort of like aggravate our problems in as far as other issues are concerned.
Okay. Now, the national lockdown, Richard, has been implemented as one of the measures to mitigate against the spread of the coronavirus, and that's just not in Zimbabwe but worldwide. However, this has left many workers, both in the formal and informal sectors, uncertain on their income streams. So what are the implications of COVID-19 on labour, and what do you think can be done to guarantee the safety of workers?
It's a bit of a difficult call, Andy. Let me take, for example, I think it was Ghana during this past week. They've had to loosen some of the restrictions so as to allow one or two essential businesses to open up the space and at least to keep their economy going. So my recommendation, in as much as the health implications of the pandemic, obviously, it's one side of the coin, but the economic implications of the lockdown is as much a reality as it is on the other side. So my recommendation would be, I think we need to relook at ways of enforcing the lockdown with minimum disruption to economic activity. I know it's a difficult call, but we have to strike a bit of a balance between the two, because on one end, we are trying to fight COVID, but remember, people might as well die of hunger. So it's a bit of a difficult call.
That takes me to my final question to you, because obviously the lockdown may do two things. It may, one, increase poverty levels in Zimbabwe, and two, also increase inequality gaps between the rich and the poor. What would you comment on that?
Yeah, obviously the nature of our economy, we've always been an economy that doesn't follow the normal distribution in terms of the distribution of income. So, like you rightly pointed out, this COVID-19 affects the poor in a bigger way than it is affecting those who have. So there has to be a deliberate attempt on the side of the government to even out the differences and sort of like create a level playing field for everyone, such that we don't leave our most vulnerable members of the society to bear the full brunt of this lockdown.
Richard Marariwe, economist, thank you very much for talking on the National Pulse.
Thank you, Andy.
Now, thank you. Now, John, interesting, because one area that we didn't speak about, because I wanted you to look at this, was Zimbabwe normally receives about $600 million US, north of that, in fact, in diaspora remittances annually. What impact will COVID-19 have on this? Because it seems that the money transfer agencies are doing a roaring trade at the moment, but there is expected to be a dip in remittances, is there not?
Sure. Thank you very much. And I think it's actually more than 600 million in terms of remittances, because according to the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe, in 2018 and 2019, Zimbabwe receipted about 9% of its foreign currency reserve from remittances. And we have over 3 million Zimbabweans living in other countries, in South Africa, in the United Kingdom, and other countries that surround us. And this coronavirus and the restrictions that have been implemented in Zimbabwe and in the host countries have really affected the remittances for Zimbabwe. And this is going to take a huge knock on, firstly, the economy, because we're going to have reduced remittance receipts. And then secondly, at the household level, we're going to have families exposed to poverty, hunger, and food shortages, shelter, and other financial assistance that they normally receive from relatives living abroad.
Because as much as there are job pressures here, there's also the remittances are also having pressure as well, because they may be losing their jobs in the countries they're at too, or under exactly the same hardships as we are.
Definitely. And to make matters worse, you see, other countries are also now taking, and this is interesting, because many of the host countries, they're taking a nationalist approach in terms of their policies. We've heard Donald Trump talk about American citizens first. We've heard South Africa recently, Minister Tito Mboweni actually saying that after the lockdown, we need to prioritize South Africans, especially in small to medium enterprises investments. He was saying that we need to see that more than 60% of the employees are South Africans. So it means going to mean that more job losses for Zimbabweans and other foreigners living in South Africa. That also means reduced remittances, not only during the lockdown, but even post the coronavirus pandemic. So it's really a huge toll for us. And when we're talking about South Africa, for example, 56% of Zimbabwean diasporans, they are in South Africa. So what's the impact?
It's huge.
Back home.
It's unfortunate that. Now, joining us now on the National Pulse, the social and economic implications of COVID-19, is Peter Mutasa, Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions President. Peter, welcome to the National Pulse.
It's my pleasure, and thank you for inviting me, comrades.
Now, Peter, sources indicate that it is anticipated that 25% of formal and 75% of informal jobs in the country will be lost as a result of COVID-19. Look, this must be a major concern to your union. So what are you doing about it? And here's the question. Are businesses legally allowed to fire workers during this period?
So COVID-19 pandemic is simply exposing many years of bad policies and governance. What it has just done is to expose the dangers of corruption, the dangers of cartels and illicit financial flows, and the neglect of social services. A country that is have majority of its people in poverty, that does not have social protection. It also exposes the inequalities that we face as a nation. If you talk about social distance, for example, you can't implement it in the ghettos where we stay in Mapuku, in Fakose. And also, it is exposing seriously the many years of neoliberal policies like austerity. We no longer have any capacity to deal with this pandemic. So Zimbabwe has got its own peculiar humanitarian crisis issues and factors that are just going to be exacerbated by COVID-19. So if you look at the job losses, it's very serious because we don't have many people in employment. We only have 2.8 people employed, and 76% of that they are informal jobs, which do not have social protection, no paid leave, and the like. So this is catastrophic. We are in a big crisis. What can only mitigate it is sound policies. Unfortunately, the government is messing up. Unlike other governments are around the globe, for example, South Africa, which is fully consulting. We can only get out of the crisis through consultations, and we come up with an agreed social contract during the lockdown and also post-COVID. This is not happening. Government is just pronouncing policies on its own, and some of them very, very dangerous. If you look at what they are doing in the informal sector, which employs over 2.2 million people, they are destroying the market stores, they are destroying the jobs that they are supposed to be protecting at a time when we need to protect the jobs. So this is the major challenge that we have. If you also look at
Peter, to be fair, though, I mean, if we look at job losses, did the government not say just before or just as the lockdown started that there would be a moratorium on businesses firing workers, and also, workers wouldn't be allowed even though they were forced to stay at home due to the lockdown?
No, it's actually the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions which made that proposal as they proposed the COVID-19 response to the tripartite negotiating forum. So the government did not check that. There's no pronouncement. There's no formal pronouncement on that. The government simply urged employers. And when you are facing such a crisis, you can't just use moral suasion on some of these issues. We're supposed to sit down agreed, and in the tripartite negotiating forum, fortunately, employers' bodies agreed that we cannot deepen this crisis by terminating employment. But the government did not play its part because the employment relationship has got three parties. It's the employers, the employees, and also the government as the regulator. So it did not make such a pronouncement. So what we are seeing, some employers have dismissed workers, some have terminated or suspended payment of salaries, some are terminating those who are on fixed-term contracts. A lot of unfair labor practices are happening, but that is unlawful because the Labour Act has not been suspended by any other enactment. It still supersedes any other enactment that has been pronounced now. So in terms of the Labour Act, an employer cannot dismiss employees without a legal reason.
All right. Now, Peter, that takes me to my next question. Thank you for that, because that's exactly what I wanted to hear from you, to understand, are employers allowed to just willy-nilly fire workers or let them go without following the Labour Act in Zimbabwe? But even more so, I mean, reports are that workers are being forced to take unpaid leave, accept partial or zero pay during the lockdown. What would be the union's position on this?
That is clearly unlawful. The Labour Act, like I've said, is still operational. The Constitution is still operational. The rights of workers that are guaranteed in Section 65 of the Constitution are still available to the workers and can be enforced. And also the rights of workers that are provided in terms of the Labour Act, for example, Section 6 guarantees workers to fair wage, which is either provided by a piece of law. In this case, we have got the minimum wage statutory instrument that was promulgated. We also have statutory instruments that were negotiated as collective bargaining agreements by various national employment councils. Those are still available and they are still functioning. And workers can still enforce those. Unfortunately, majority of workers cannot access the courts now, but we are waiting. As soon as courts are open, and as soon as in some cases we are planning to have urgent applications, those workers must be paid. Those workers whose contracts have been terminated, that is an unlawful termination. The employer can only terminate on the basis of either misconduct, and that is not a misconduct, or for operational reasons. And the employer has to pay the terminal benefits and the retrenchment packages.
Now, Peter,
you
did mention this, but of course, I mean, you as a union obviously are aware that your workers work for business, and the recent Confederation of Zimbabwe Industries survey stated that businesses, and I think it was about 3 weeks ago, they said that businesses could only pay for a further 3.6 weeks because they didn't have any cash reserves. So you, on the one side, have workers that obviously want to be employed and are forced to the lockdown to not go to work. You have businesses that haven't got the cash reserves to pay them. So let me ask you this. What policy steps or stimulus packages is your union advocating to both business and government to keep workers employed, bearing those points I mentioned in mind?
So it's not every business that is not able to pay. That must be also clarified. Businesses are not homogeneous. They are very different. And some businesses are able even to carry for 3 months or 4 months. So what we need is to understand as a nation that we greatly need solidarity at the moment. The business community has to play their part, labor has to play its part, and government has to play its part. We have a very dangerous context in Zimbabwe where the majority of workers are earning far below the poverty datum line, which is now 6.420. And majority of them are earning even below the food poverty line, if you look at your agriculture and domestic workers. So we cannot ignore these factors. Zimbabwe has got its particular context, and this must be addressed. So the major thing that we need is to have consultations and to have negotiations. We must come up with an agreed policy position. But that one thing that we must do urgently is that moratorium on retrenchment and termination of employment. Secondly, the government has to come in and reprioritize its expenditures. The government for a long time has left citizens on their own, but this is the time where it should come in and enhance our health delivery services, social protection. The vulnerable groups must be protected by the government. We have already suggested that the government should look at providing for the food poverty line. which was about 1.863 in December, and versus the 200 that the government intends to pay. So that's one area. The second aspect is businesses that are failing must be assisted, and we must have particular attention to some sectors like hospitality sector, tourism, and other sectors like transport and logistics, which have been seriously adversely affected. But all businesses must be looked at, and we must come up with a stimulus package, either in terms of debts restructuring, or we can look at taxes and how we can reduce taxation. Some of the issues that we need, because our government also has its own challenges in terms of the resource mobilization. We have advocated through TNF that we need to set up a task force, a multi-sector task force for resource mobilization that can approach the international community. The government has no good name out there. So we need eminent people, eminent organizations to come together and look at resource mobilization so that we can have stimulus packages that can address issues in the for job protection. But companies that are going to be assisted there must be conditions. We have seen many times when the stimulus packages or bailouts are handed over to companies, the next day they collect the check and they dismiss workers, they retrench. The next day they go back to buy back their shares and then just benefit out of nothing. So we must sit down, discuss these things seriously, and see how we can assist each other. But government has to play its part, labor its part, and business its part. We need a social contract.
Peter Mutasa, Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions President, many thanks for appearing on the National Pulse.
It's my pleasure.
Now, unfortunately, we're going to have to take a breather. You're watching the National Pulse. Our discussion today, the social and economic implications of COVID-19. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimpaper's TV network, ZTN, and our partners, the Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development, Zimcodd. So I said, time for us to take a breather. In our final segment, we will be joined by the Honourable Priscilla Mishihirambwi Mushonga, Chairperson Parliamentary Portfolio on Primary and Secondary Education. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back from ZTN Studios in Harare, Zimbabwe. This is the National Pulse. Our discussion today, the social and economic implications of COVID-19. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimpaper's TV network, ZTN, and our partners, the Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development, Zimcodd. You know, John, there were some very interesting points raised there by Peter Mutasa from ZCTU President. But I want to take that a little bit further forward, because the decline in disposable income is a concern from both an economic and social perspective. Households were already facing economic hardships pre-lockdown. So how has COVID-19 actually made that worse?
Thank you very much, Andy. I think, like you highlighted, Mr. Mutasa there, pointing out very fundamental issues. There were pre-existing conditions that were already affecting a number of households, particularly the poor and vulnerable. And most families and households were not actually, earning above the poverty, datum line. And this is worsened because of reduced working hours or reduced earnings. We talked about remittances and so forth. And there's also the expectation that government is supposed to be, giving out, some social cushioning for households.
Some stimulus package.
The stimulus package, even at household level. That has not happened yet. There have been commitments, yes, and people are still looking forward to that. And already we have raised a voice to say that it's not even sufficient. There's need to review that. But also, yes, we need to look at the supply side as well, to say that what's inside the government, coffers, does it really?
I mean, we did speak about this before the breather, the issue of the price increases. I mentioned figures of 500, 600%.
Sure.
In fact, prices have gone up today again. I mean, how would you expect vulnerable households, poor households, in fact, any household to cope in such a current environment where you're not getting your full pay, you're getting 25% or zero, you're not going to work due to the lockdown, which of course needs to be in place, let's not dispute that, but prices are going up at the same time. How would they cope?
It's a very difficult position, Andy, for everyone, because on the side of business, they want to retain their stock as much as possible. They want to keep the hoarding that is happening because of speculations. But also, it has exposed poor and vulnerable households because families are struggling to get a decent meal a day because of the prices and so forth. And now it also goes on to expose a number of citizens as a result of the scramble to get subsidized goods. For example, meal. Go around the shopping areas in the residential suburbs. Now and again, there are people gathered in their numbers, in their thousands actually, trying to scramble for the subsidized meal.
In fact, I saw one recently, and there was almost a riot because people just wanted to get the subsidized minimum.
Yes. People actually have to depend to call on the military and police to put some order for people to buy that. So that's actually an indication of how people are exposed. Like I said earlier on, because of the lockdown and everyone at home, consumption has gone up, but also the income is dwindled.
Now, joining us now on the National Pulse, the social and economic implications of COVID-19, is Honourable Priscilla Misiharambwi Mushonga, Chairperson, Parliamentary Portfolio on Primary and Secondary Education. Priscilla, welcome to the National Pulse.
Thank you very much. Although the volume is a bit problematic, I don't know why.
Okay, I'll try and speak up, Priscilla. Now, all education has come to an abrupt halt, considering that schools closed earlier than normal, and the nation is uncertain on when the schools will reopen. With students writing exams at all levels in June, is there a countrywide plan to ensure that learning continues?
Well, I can't speak to a clear plan, but I think from us members of parliament, one of the issues that we've been pushing with the ministry is to come out very clearly about what it is that they propose should be done. Firstly, I know that consultations with the trade unions, the teachers' unions, teachers have basically said they do not want for schools to open. For a number of reasons. The first one being that they just think that they are being put onto a war zone without protection. There are issues to do with the economic issues that pre-existed before coming onto COVID, which obviously have become worse now, given all these conversations that we've been having around the increase in prices, etc. So we still have to discuss as a committee what our position would be. Suffice to say, we just don't get to a sense that there is a properly planned or thought-through process on what we should do with the education system now, in terms of balancing the saving lives and the saving time.
Right. Now,
and if you were to ask me, because I'm still speaking in my individual capacity, without having had the collective position that my committee has, is that we surely need to prioritize what is important for us right now. If we can't do the June examinations, then we need to be saying, do we want to look at will there be a possibility for November? If it's not, then we basically say to ourselves, we have lost 2020. Let's look at what we are going to do with 2021.
Now, if I pick up from that point, I mean, we've seen the emergence of online learning platforms, but that's mostly in the urban areas, and who the people in the urban areas can embrace the technology in order to keep their children learning. But obviously, that cannot be possible in rural areas. The disparities, obviously, between the unequal access to technology, for example. What can be done now to maintain learning without being able for the children to be able to go to the classrooms?
Again, I think people are being too simplistic about that conversation. I have actually been dealing with people that are offering e-learning and that have the kind of e-learning that could still be used within rural communities. One of the things that we need to analyze in Zimbabwe and analyze properly is that the mode of communication that we now have, even within rural communities, is IT. You can't deny that. We have no postal service anymore. So basically, I don't know, I can't find a term to put it, but the penetration of IT, even within rural communities, is quite high. I think people just do not want to think around a change mechanism and spend a little bit of time. Like I said, I spend a lot of time with an organization that is looking at e-learning. India, and they've partnered with somebody here in Zimbabwe. I'm actually quite amazed at the kind of things that they would be able to do. But let's put off IT. Let's look at issues to do with the radios. Before I went to school, I know that my brothers, for example, used to do a lot of learning through radio stations. You would have times where you would know that they would be teaching maths or generally capacitating parents to be able to do a bit of homeschooling. Our problem right now in Zimbabwe is the refusal to look at the issue that COVID is just not a 2-month, 3-day wonder. It's going to be with us for quite some time.
Right. And
force ourselves, therefore, to begin to say, what is the alternative way of managing this? And that's what is getting me to panic a lot, in that, you know, we seem to be in this sense where we then say, oh, economically things are very bad, therefore the only option is that we open up. We open up and we surely die.
Now, Priscilla, there's been growing calls from parents for government to put a moratorium on school fees. I mean, is this something that can be seriously considered? And you know, what are the mitigation measures to limit the implications of coronavirus in Zimbabwe on parents? I mean, this moratorium, is that feasible?
It is feasible. It is feasible, but your problem is, again, your private sector. Because right now, most of the complaints I'm getting is that the private sector has already started sending letters to parents to say, pay school fees, and have given, you know, ridiculous amounts of money for paying school fees, even before we have even thought through about where we are going from here. So we really, whether it's your private sector in terms of, you know, those that are in the retail industry, or private sector in terms of those that are doing private schooling, we have a problem around capitalist and capitalism. And we need to deal with it as it is right now.
Right. Now, Priscilla, gender-based violence and child abuse appears to be on the increase. Statistics from Musasa show a 3-fold increase, if not more, in domestic violence. Now, what are the implications of COVID-19 on women? And what interventions have been proposed to combat this? I ask you because I know you're very involved in gender violence and it's fighting against it.
Well, I know that from civic society, and one has to thank civic society in this instance, they have tried to set up systems, toll-free numbers, where, you know, people that are in those circumstances, including children that are being abused, can quickly get into and phone and go into a toll-free number. How those civic societies are then linked to government systems so that we can trigger police response, emergency police response in circumstances where somebody is being abused, is where the missing link is. But at least at a very basic level, this is why Musasa has those good numbers. At a basic level, Musasa Child Line, their toll-free numbers are still operational. But I think the challenge is how do you link it in circumstances where you want the state to intervene or the police to intervene.
Now, Priscilla, government has put in place a stimulus package. They talked about $200 per head, particularly in urban areas. And of course, we have declining disposable income in households, which means that parents' inability to provide nutritious, balanced meals for their children. Has this been taken into account by government? Because government seems to be focusing more on struggling urban areas and through their normal food plans. But what about children? For example, in the USA, they're giving $500 for every child under the age of 17. What would you say?
Well, it's certainly not enough. But let's also talk about what do we have currently in country. Perhaps what we should be looking at is that there is a lot of support that is coming from cooperating partners. We need to have that basket and be clear that the current basket that has been brought in by our supporting partners towards social protection, where is it coming in? The 2% that we're paying around tax, all of it, in my opinion, should be going towards social protection. But let's get a proper figure that says this is what we have and this is what makes sense, and a proper distribution mechanism. Because again, speaking like a member of parliament, one of the problems is that there is lack of transparency around how this social protection is being given out. Let's have a clear criteria. How is it being given out? Who to who? And how is it spent? That, again, is not so clear. So we are hoping that since Parliament is going to be opening soon, we should be able, both at committee level but also at parliamentary level, to begin to put those questions on board and to ensure that we continue to do our oversight with the executive, because we have just basically been out there and absolutely no connection with executive.
Honourable Priscilla Misi-Hairambwi Mushonga, Chairperson, Parliamentary Portfolio on Primary and Secondary Education. Many thanks for joining us on the National Pulse.
Thank you.
Now, before you go, Honourable Priscilla Misi-Hairambwi Mushonga, I just wanted to find out, you made reference to Parliament opening very soon, and citizens are very concerned and worried about the inactivity of Parliament and why it seemed reasonable for Parliament to go on recess at such a time as this, when we're expecting Parliament to play its oversight role in terms of government expenditure and also in terms of other social and economic cushioning measures. Like you rightly highlighted, that there is need for committees to be sitting and assisting in terms of policy direction.
Yeah, I think basically what happened with Parliament was, you remember that when we were struck with COVID, even at a scientific level, yes, we're doing social distancing, but members of Parliament were also going to be at risk. I mean, you know our Parliament and you know the problems associated with social distancing. So I think it was basically a decision around issues of safety. But I know that parliamentary administration and us as committee chairpersons, for example, for my committee, I've been working with UNICEF around putting up a virtual way of communicating among ourselves as members of Parliament, but of continuing to do oversight over the ministries that we are covering. And we should be, in the next few days, when Parliament sits, there should be clarity around how do these virtual conferences go. As you know, this was supposed to be, in my opinion, a more of a panel where I could see you guys and speak to you. It hasn't happened. So we are looking around, sorting that out, but certainly there is an agency around ensuring that we go back into playing an oversight, more importantly now during this COVID-19 era.
Sure. Priscilla, thank you very much indeed. That's a very good question. It's true, Parliament plays such an important role, and also monitoring of where donations are going, where money is being spent, transparency and accountability. Priscilla, thank you very much indeed.
All right. Thank you.
John,
stay safe.
Yeah,
thank you, Priscilla.
John,
all right.
Now, just quickly going on, multinational financial institutions, they obviously do play a huge role, and they have played a huge role in Zimbabwe going into our past, but also now even more so. So what negative effects will that have, COVID-19 have, on their ability to help us as it now, and also, of course, on the economy?
Okay, so international financial institutions play a very important role in terms of development assistance, even during and before any disaster or case. Firstly, through development financing. We are looking at institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and other organizations that have assisted countries in terms of development. But now, as it stands, we've had, for example, the World Health Organization have pledged and contributed in terms of finances towards mitigating effects of the COVID-19 in the health sector, and many other organizations.
World Food Programme, of course, has come to bat. World Vision is also there. I mean, these guys are playing their part as best they can.
Definitely, yes. But I think from where I stand, we expect a little bit more to be done from these institutions especially for developing countries. Last week, if you are aware that the IMF rolled out some assistance in terms of debt relief to about 25 countries. And I think the majority of them were African countries. Of course, Zimbabwe was not included for reasons, yes, that were explained. But we feel that there is need to extend this debt relief even to countries like Zimbabwe that have defaulted on their payments to other creditors like the World Bank. There is need, because this crisis is an exogenous shock. It's something that is beyond our control, something that we could not, that we did not invite, and there is need also to cushion the suffering citizens, and therefore debt cancellation from Zimcodd is #1 priority in terms of international financial institutions. That if the moment they cancel our debts, they free up funds that can be channeled to health delivery system.
And this is no longer a dispute between governments. This is about people.
It's about the people.
Dying.
It's about the people.
This is time when people must forget about all of that,
yes,
and come together as institutions and governments to help everybody around the world.
Definitely.
Well, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our show. We'd like to thank our panelists, John Maketo, that's Zimcodd Programs Manager, Peter Mutasa, Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions President, Honorable Priscilla Mishihirambwi Mushonga, Chairperson, Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Primary and Secondary Education, and Richard Mawarire, an economist. You've been watching The National Pulse, the social and economic implications of COVID-19. This is from ZTN Studios in Harare, Zimbabwe. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimpapers TV Network, ZTN, and our partners, the Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development, Zimcodd. Social distancing, self-isolation and travel restrictions have forced a decrease in the workforce across all economic sectors and may cause many jobs to be lost. Schools have closed down as COVID-19 has also affected all levels of the education system, from preschool to tertiary education, and the need for commodities and manufactured products has decreased. The resilience of the agricultural sector has been tested by the COVID-19 outbreak. A global crash in demand from hotels and restaurants has seen prices of agricultural commodities drop by 20%. In the manufacturing sector, 80% of businesses anticipate a decline in turnover over the next 2 quarters, with 98% admitting concern about the negative impact of the pandemic on business operations. The hospitality and travel industry have perhaps been the most hard hit, with the World Travel and Tourism Council warning that 50 million jobs in the global travel and tourism sector may be at risk. Lockdown and social distancing measures to prevent the spread of the coronavirus have heightened fears of increasing domestic violence, which includes physical, emotional and sexual abuse. With fears of a new recession and financial collapse, times like these call for resilient and strong leadership in healthcare, business, government and the wider society. A broad socio-economic development plan, including sector-by-sector plans and an ecosystem that encourages entrepreneurship so that those with robust and sustainable business models can be allowed to flourish. It is prudent that governments constantly reassess and reevaluate the state of play and ensure that whatever it takes promise is truly delivered. I'm Andy Hodges. Goodbye, and you all be safe.